I'm Tim, and the organiser of the event. Also one of the people who sort of helps programme all the talks. And we were very, very happy to have our speaker come over here at relatively short notice. I think we got in touch in about January. Sebastian McJetters is one of the contributors to this book here, which is edited by Tuttle and published by Casey Taft and Vegan Publishers. Selection of 29 essays. It's basically pro-intersectional veganism. In a nutshell. I read it in January, and Christopher's essay really stood out, actually. It really set me thinking. And it's just really nice to see Sebastian McJetters coming over. Big hand, please. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. I'm Sebastian. Just call me Sebastian. That's the easiest thing to do. Hey, Casey. Just to give you a little background about me, I moved to Prague just a few months ago from New York, so I'm American, in case you couldn't tell from my accent. And in New York, I do teach Speciesism at Columbia. I work with Casey at Vegan Publishers as a copy editor. I did appear in the book that we put out that Tim told you all about, Circles of Compassion, Connecting Issues of Justice. And what we're here to do today is actually talk about intersections of justice, and specifically about veganism's image problem. I'm actually glad to have some faces that were in the earlier lecture that we did about bullying and reproducing patterns or cycles of violence in veganism. So like some of this, there might be a little crossover from the earlier talk, but you guys can just like sit in the amen corner and give me a little support. And thank you for that. But yeah, like we actually prepared this lecture today. And by the way, like I'm not a really great formal speaker. So like my way of doing a lecture is to put together a bunch of slides, kind of forget what I put on the slides, and then talk my way through them. So like this is like, you know, we're all going to like find out what I put together at the same time. but yeah, like we actually did this because what I did, the first class that I taught at Columbia, we kind of put together a gallery walk where we put like a blank sheet of paper in different places around the classroom. And we asked students to like do a little word association and talk about their thoughts on veganism, speciesism, and different kinds of terminology that we would use in the vegan community. And I very quickly realized when we were doing that gallery walk that, you know, that the lesson plan that I had put together was going to be completely worthless with this crowd. That, you know, they had a lot of ideas and a lot of stereotypes about veganism that were, in my opinion, or in my experience of veganism, were very untrue and really disappointing. And this was a class of graduate students, too. So these were students that were taking courses in the Department of Social Work that were already familiar with systems of oppression like racism, like homo-antagonism, like sexism, all of these different intersection oppressions, and really had negative opinions about veganism and about speciesism in general, and a lot of their word associations you can see on here. I'm actually standing right in front of it, and that's not cool. People starve, people associate vegans with hipsters, and you can see in the upper left corner here, middle to upper class. And that was something, I didn't know it at the time when I was taking these pictures, but that was like a very common theme in the associations that people were making. And there was this sort of image of this type of Sally Yoga Pants lady that shops exclusively at Whole Foods and buys like organically grown, well-massaged, like university-educated kale. And that was, you know, and that's what vegans do. And, you know, and there were all of these associations with vegans and with veganism that, you know, that felt very misleading. And even after the class, you know, the first time I taught the class, it was actually just supposed to be a guest lecture. And after that, like the university asked me to stay and come back every semester and do it again. But after that class, you know, as a one-time thing, one of the students came up to me, and she was a young woman of color, and, you know, and she said, "Thank you for this," because she didn't see herself represented in veganism. And that's a problem, because veganism should be for everyone, and we should associate veganism with something that is available and important to everyone, because it is actually a really important part of our social justice framework, and we neglect it. And, you know, and that's largely because of the way that mainstream veganism has grown in our community. Even as I look around the room today, I don't see as much diversity as I would hope to. And I see a couple of diverse faces, but not nearly enough. And so we're going to talk about that. But in order to talk about that, we probably should have a framework of, like, you know, of words that a lot of us are unfamiliar with, or we may be familiar with them and they make us really uncomfortable. And the first of those words is privilege. We feel like we understand privilege, we feel like we know privilege, and when we talk about privilege in terms of systemic oppression, it creates some very, very unsettling feelings. People hear me say privilege and they immediately assume that, like, I mean that somebody walked up to you, gave you a bag of money and a kiss on the lips. And that's not what privilege is. We did the word again in really big letters to make sure that you guys understand how important it is. We need to understand privilege and how privilege manifests itself before we can actually talk about systemic oppression. And we got this from everyday feminism because I'm lazy and I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So we talk about this. We can define privilege as a set of unearned benefits given to people who fit into a specific social group. Society grants privilege to people because of certain aspects of their identity. Aspects of a person's identity can include race, class, gender, sexual orientation, language, geographical location, ability, and religion, to name a few. Here's something that's really important to understand about privilege. It does not go both ways. Female privilege does not exist, no matter what the internet tells you. And the internet will tell you some really wild things, but female privilege does not exist because women don't have institutional power. Similarly, black privilege, trans privilege, poor privilege don't exist because those groups don't have institutional power. I'm probably gonna check in a few times with you guys just to make sure that you're still in the conversation, because it does get very uncomfortable sometimes when we're talking about privilege, because all of us have privilege in some ways. All of us are differently privileged, and all of us are differently oppressed in different ways. But yeah, like people, like females don't have like female privilege. That is not a thing that happens. Black people don't have black privilege. People might think that we do because we have a black president. But guess what? In the United States, black people are still getting shot. That is not an awesome thing. It's not how privilege works. It's not how it works. Just because we have a black president doesn't mean that like we live in a post-racial society. Black people are still 4 times as likely in the United States to be arrested for crimes that white people are also committing. Black people still have poorer educational outcomes. Black people still have less access to financial stability or financial security than our white counterparts. There isn't like any black privilege because 1 or 2 people or a small group of people have been able to navigate a system that is specifically set up to advantage people that are not black. We went way ahead. I hate when that happens. Like, oppression is what happens when power and privilege meet. That's what creates institutional or systemic oppression, and that's what we need to understand about privilege. And we also need to understand the difference between hierarchical oppression and intersecting oppressions, and this is going to be kind of like an Intersectionality 101 discussion. Hierarchical oppression kind of encourages us to think of oppression as something that exists in kind of a vacuum, something that we should compartmentalize, something like, okay, I'm black and I need to think of black issues, or I need to take care of like racial oppression or racial antagonism before I can think about women. And similarly, women think about these things, like I need to take care of what's happening to my group before I can think about this other marginalized community. And it sets up this unnecessary hierarchy that actually unconsciously feeds that self-same hierarchy. And what we end up ignoring is that like oppression does not exist in a vacuum. Oppression actually intersects, because black oppression and female oppression can occur at the same time, and it does occur at the same time. There are black women. We need people of color to work together to help end like systemic oppression against women. We need, thank you. We need to think about oppression as something that really reciprocates and informs upon itself. Wow, things are happening with the microphone. Testing. This is still cool. So, you're turning it up? Yeah. Okay. Like, can you guys hear me in the cheap seats? Okay. All right. Cool. All right. As long as we're all in the same place, and I don't have to hold it so close to my mouth. So yeah, like it's really important to think of oppression as something that is specifically intersectional. And you're probably going to hear some people say that, like, when we think of intersectionality in terms of animal rights and in terms of veganism, it prioritizes human issues over animal issues, and that's simply not true. That doesn't mean that people can't abuse intersectional justice or intersectional oppression. Some people absolutely do, but when you truly consider intersectionality and the many different intersecting oppressions there are out there, it actually elevates non-human animal oppression to something that we need to prioritize and something that should not be deprioritized, because non-human animals actually stand at the confluence of so many different types of intersection oppressions that we need to consciously consider them. We need to really examine how we treat animals in a society that privileges human lives. And so that brings us to speciesism, and we have to have a conversation about what speciesism is, because even though we've gone vegan, there's a surprising number of people who feel like, because I've gone vegan, I've transcended speciesism. It's done and dusted. I can put a line through it, and now I can go about my life. I'm vegan now, and speciesism is not an issue for me, but that's not actually what speciesism is. Speciesism, as defined by Corey Wren, speciesism is institutional discrimination and, to a lesser extent, individual prejudice against non-human animals based on their species. Speciesism is violence against non-human animals that is perpetuated by the privileged human species, usually for the benefit of humans. It's conducted based on the belief that non-human species are lesser in some way. Speciesism relies on the understanding that there is an us and a them, that humans are at the top and other animals are below. And even though we've gone vegan, we still live in a society that has conditioned us toward speciesism from birth. And we really need to actively deconstruct that as we go forward. We really need to actively think about what our relationship with animals looks like and how our veganism should manifest itself going forward, and in what ways speciesism interacts with other oppressions, which brings us to classism. Usually when I'm having these conversations, I'm having conversations with a group of non-vegan people and like convincing them why speciesism should be included in their social justice repertoire. And you know, this is the reverse, and it's a kind of welcome thing, but it's a little foreign to have to actually talk to vegans about how veganism and speciesism interact with other forms of oppression. And we're talking about classism here because, like, I feel like the UK and British audiences are probably going to have a different relationship with systemic racism than we do in the United States. So we're going to table racism for a little bit and talk about classism and why it's important to focus some of our activism, or a great deal of our activism, on communities that don't have the same level of access that a lot of us in this room do. I know that I have a great deal of economic and social and educational privilege in that, like, I'm able to come to Brighton and have a conversation with you good people who are able to afford a ticket to come in here and have access to all of this great stuff, all of this great educational, all of this, you know, great community that we've built, and, you know, all of the great food that's out there that I know that some of you can't wait to get back to. But yeah, this is something that's very important that came from the American Journal of Public Health in 1990. Kids require 8 to 15 encounters with a particular food until they become accustomed to it. And once they're used to it, they'll not only eat it, but also come to choose those foods on their own. Those foods that we're usually talking about are often fruits and vegetables, the backbone of veganism. Yeah, because kids usually, traditionally, when we're talking about these things, love chicken nuggets, they love burgers, they love pizza, and they usually have very negative associations with broccoli, with tofu, with like any kind of bean, with all of these different vegetables and fruits that are out there. Lower income families are more likely to give up on attempts to feed their kids dreaded good-for-you foods like Brussels sprouts and resort to less healthy foods their kids will eat, while richer families will keep at it until their kids have developed a palate for them. And now that first quote was from 1990. This one's actually from 2016. So there's been like a large body of research that actually leads to the same outcomes, that really reproduces the same results. And you know, this is a problem because what we end up doing is, this is actually part of the framework that reinforces the notion that veganism is for rich people. Veganism is for wealthier people. Veganism is for people who have access to different kinds of foods. And when we, like, when this happens, what we end up doing is that we keep lower income families and people in lower classes in these cycles of classism and speciesism, because not only do they not have access to those foods, we then tend to adopt attitudes that these people, quote unquote, whoever these people may be, are unable to make the same ethical connections that we were able to make, and we think lesser of them. And it's an unconscious thing, but it's something that I encounter over and over again. Oh dear, this poor woman's name is Caitlin Daniel, and this is what happens when I make slides at like 11 o'clock at night. It's not Catalin Daniel. So I'm a copy editor, and that's going to irk me until I go back and fix that later on. Many low-income respondents minimize the risk of food waste by purchasing what their children like, often calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods. That's again from Caitlin Daniel in her research in 2016. It was just last month that this was released, so like it's very, very recent, and and it really reinforces the narrative that we were talking about. And so we ask ourselves, how do we reverse this trend? Like we understand the importance of including people who have less access than us in our activism as we go forward. But what does that mean? What does that realistically look like for people? And I'll tell you, there are a couple of organizations out there that are doing exactly that, and Food Empowerment Project is one of them. How many of you have heard of Food Empowerment Project? Okay, we've got a few people in the room. And this is why this lecture is important, because we want more people to be aware of the work that they're doing. Food Empowerment Project was started by Lauren Ornelas, and we can talk a little bit about it. Food Empowerment Project seeks to create a more just and sustainable world by recognizing the power of one's food choices. We encourage healthy food choices that reflect a more compassionate society by spotlighting the abuse of animals on farms, the depletion of natural resources, unfair working conditions for produce workers, and the unavailability of healthy foods in low-income areas. This is an exclusively vegan organization. And I tell you, when you go to the website, which is www.foodispower.org, they have really done all of the homework for us. When we're making connections with people from lower income backgrounds, and quite often those end up being people of color, because poverty impacts people of color at much more drastic rates than people of other racial backgrounds. And they actually have grocery lists that help people on fixed incomes to make a vegan diet work for them, because that's one of the first questions that you're going to hear from people. Because when you've got like a single mom of 6 kids working 2 jobs, the last thing that she wants you to hear, the last thing she wants to hear from you is like, you've got to be nicer to animals. Because, okay, that's great and everything, but she's going to need a framework for making that work for her if it's going to be important for her. We have to care about these issues. We have to care about the things that are important to other people in order to have them care about the things that are important to us. And like food insecurity is a huge thing that's important to people, and Food Empowerment Project does that. Food Empowerment Project also has resources for vegans as well, because if you're a vegan who is concerned with food insecurity, if you are a vegan who is concerned with worker safety, if you're a vegan who is concerned about sourcing your food, Food Empowerment Project actually talks about slave chocolate. It talks about the working conditions and the average rate of pay for people who are picking our vegetables and our produce in other parts of the planet, because we can say that veganism is for everybody, and on the surface that sounds great. But when we talk about that, Lauren Ornelas has gone on record as saying who is the everybody that we're talking about? Because veganism is really easy for you and me, but it's not necessarily easy for the South American woman who is picking our organic tomatoes for 7 cents a day, because that's not enough for her to live on. And veganism is probably not going to be easy for her, especially since we keep stealing quinoa from South America. It's a really crummy food for some of us if it's not ethically sourced. Another organization is a WellFed World, Feeding Families, Saving Animals. And WellFed World was started by Dawn Moncrief. And just a little background about that. A WellFed World is a hunger relief and animal protection organization chipping away at 2 of the world's most immense, unnecessary, and unconscionable forms of suffering. The suffering of people hungry from lack of food, and the suffering of animals used and abused for food. We have a positive, practical, and action-led approach that produces immediate assistance for those in need and structural change for lasting results. In addition to our direct programs, we raise funds, partner with, and promote innovative, highly effective projects that strengthen plant-based feeding and farming programs, farm animal care and rescue efforts, vegan advocacy, and community building. Again, all of the organizations that we're going to talk about today and all of the individuals that are working with these organizations are exclusively vegan. And yeah, Dawn actually came from, I believe that it is the farm animal rights movement. That was where she was working before she started before she started WellFed World. How many of you are familiar with that as well? Okay, we've just got Casey? All right, you and me, bro, you and me. This one's near and dear to my heart. Chili on Wheels. This right here is an image of Michelle Carrera. She is an activist in New York. And I can describe it myself, but I would rather let Michelle talk about Chili on Wheels in her own words. Michelle says, I started Chili on Wheels last Thanksgiving. That was Thanksgiving a year ago, because this program has been working for about 2 years now, to teach my son about the importance of helping your community. We made 15 vegan chilies and distributed them to the homeless in the park. Today, we serve vegan food to people in need every single week, and even have chapters in Denver, Portland, San Diego, and Puerto Rico, feeding a total of 800 people a month. And I find that so innovative. And when you talk about creative activism and something that you can do individually, Michelle has done an incredible job with her son, Ali, who's great. But yeah, like when I was living in New York, it was like she never missed a Saturday. Every Saturday, she was at Tompkins Park in Lower Manhattan, and she was feeding people food that she cooked. On Friday night, when everybody else's weekend was just getting started, Michelle was grinding in the kitchen with a big old cauldron making chili. And these cauldrons have gotten bigger, and she's gotten more volunteers, and they're making chili alongside her, and they're taking it, and they're building relationships with people directly in the community, hungry people, homeless people, and helping people to actually make a connection with veganism and why veganism is important. You have conversations with these people, and you find out about their lives, and you find out what's important to them, and they in turn realize how empowering it is. And this is something that is important to so many different communities. And that's what we want to do. Veganism and activism in general is about empowering people to make better choices, educating people, but really, really empowerment. And, you know, and Chili on Wheels absolutely does that. That's one of the things that I absolutely make it a point to do every time that I go back to New York for however long that I'm there. If there's a Saturday that like intersects with that, like I make it my business to see how Michelle is doing. And she's got an increasingly large group of people that contribute to this every weekend. Racism. I told you we would get to racism. This is the fun part. Just make sure that we're still in the conversation, because I tell you what, it's really hard to be a black person standing in front of a room full of white people and say racism. But yeah, like it's something that we really tend to ignore in the vegan community. And it's not an active type of ignoring racism, because like we're unaware largely of our privilege. That's why privilege is so successful, because it's invisible to us when we have it. We don't realize it. Just to give you an anecdote, like I as a man never actually thought about when I would leave a party at night if I'm taking public transportation to get home. I'm going to leave at 9:30 every time because I'm lazy. But like women have to actively think about like when they're going to leave and catch like the Q train to get home, because they don't want to leave too late. Women actively choose what subway car they're going to stand in, or if you're in London, the tube, you know, because they can easily feel disempowered, or they can feel a lot of insecurity in groups of men. That's an invisible function of my privilege as a man, because I don't have to think about that. And racism is something that we largely don't have to think about, because it's invisible in our everyday lives. Unless you're a person who is exposed to and victimized by systemic racism, then it's always present. So we do end up talking about it. And like I said, veganism, it's very important that we have representation in veganism, because that student at the end of my first lecture that I was talking about, her name was Adana, by the way, like she said specifically that she did not see herself represented. And how sad is that? That like this is something that she never thought was for her, because she thought it was for someone else, someone that had more privilege than she had, until she saw a face that looked like hers, someone that she could identify with, that made the connection with her and took the time to do that in a sensitive way. And so here we go. We have Aph who started Black Vegans Rock. And Black Vegans Rock is actually that Aph had, she actually started the website because she had written a blog post, because she got tired of hearing the question from people, where are the black vegans? Where are the black people in veganism? And Aph said, you know what? I'm going to tell you where the black vegans are. I'm going to make a list of 100 black vegans. And every time I get that question, I'm going to tell you to go and find one of those black vegans and write a 250-word essay about that person. And she had written the blog post after she had tracked down 100 black vegans, including myself. And it had gotten shared online in social media in different spaces. And I tell you what, it was really funny, because what happened? Racism. there was a lot of pushback from like having a list of 100 black vegans, and some of you can probably guess why, because one of the first criticisms was, well, I bet it would be racist if I had a list of 100 white vegans. Yes, actually it would, because we already know where the white vegans are. They're in this room. They're out there too. We already have representation for white people in veganism. We don't need a White History Month because we're learning about that all year long. We don't need straight pride because most of you guys are probably straight. I am not. But we don't need these things. We need these things for marginalized communities. We need these things for people because it's important that we have representation. It's important that we reach out to others and let them know that they're not alone. That there is a place for you in this community. And so Black Vegans Rock is an entire project that was born of that lack of representation. And it's been growing ever since. And I'm really proud to be a part of this project. This is actually Aph right here with the afro. So she's right there in the front. And if you look her up online, she's got a website, Aphro-ism. It's Aphro-ism.com, where she talks about the intersection of racism and veganism or speciesism quite a lot, and in an extraordinarily revolutionary kind of way, ways that I never would have thought of. And of course, she posts her content there, and Casey and I are really working on her to get her book published, because I would absolutely love if Aph wrote a book that did for like the intersection of racism and speciesism what Carol Adams did back in the early 1990s when she wrote The Sexual Politics of Meat and made the connection for so many people for over 20 years now, talking about the intersection of feminism and veganism or speciesism. And here is actually an image that is like, this kind of stands at the confluence of racism and other types of less visible exclusions that we have in the vegan community. This is a picture of a Rastafari family, and we tend to exclude people in our community based on race, but we also tend to exclude people based on their religious affiliation. There's a distinct lack of representation in our community because I think, largely speaking, I think there was Faunalytics that did this survey that had revealed that we are, as if we didn't already know, a largely secular community in veganism. And it's a very unwelcoming space for people from religious backgrounds for whom like veganism like is really important. I myself identify as an atheist, and again, because of my privilege and because of like my associations, like it would never have occurred to me to explore like the fact that like religion or one's own faith is what brought them to veganism. And does anybody know why Rastafarianism and veganism is important? Raise your hand if wow, no one's raising their hand. Either you guys are an incredibly shy crew or no one actually knows the answer to this. But Rastafarian belief actually compels people toward veganism because they have the style of cooking called ital. And it's really fascinating because ital it's actually born of the word vital without the V. But ital cooking is exclusively vegan cooking. And Rastafarians have very interesting associations with like animals or very interesting relationships with animals in their religion. Marvin Park says the main reason Rastafarians don't eat meat is because animals try so hard to get away. The fear of the animals can be seen in their eyes. It's evident that they're begging for mercy. And that's something that is really, really important to a lot of people in the Rastafarian community. And like, it's not just meat, obviously. Like, people who are very serious about their faith don't use eggs, don't use dairy, don't use animals in any way, including for their clothes. They exclude animals and they want to form a different relationship with animals than the one that is already existing. And make no mistake, like, you know what, we do have relationships with animals. The relationship that we primarily have with animals in our Western society is an abusive one, but it is a relationship. And these people work to craft a different relationship with animals. And the fact that like no one in this room actually knows that or understood it really speaks to like how very unwelcoming a space veganism is for people within the religious community. And we need to work on that. We need to work on building bridges with other people. Because largely speaking, I mean, when we go upstairs and we look at like the large auditorium, there's a lot of people who cook ital food and cook Caribbean food that is exclusively vegan. And they didn't veganize this. These are vegan dishes that already exist within their culture. And we kind of appropriate the food from these cultures, and we include the food and we leave the people behind. And that really, really puts us in a very dangerous and exclusionary place, and we need to work on our inclusion, our racial inclusion, our cultural inclusion, our class inclusion, and there are so many other intersections of justice that we could talk about, but I'm probably going to start boring you if we actually do the entire Speciesism class, which is like 6 weeks long, in like a 30, 40-minute lecture. So like we're just gonna wrap up here. And this is the last slide. I figured that I don't have a snazzy way of ending the presentation, so I'm gonna give you a bag of ferrets. So you're welcome. That's like a really nice place to finish up, because like when I saw a woman walking down the street with a bag of ferrets, I said, holy shit, there's a bag of ferrets. And I've got to get a picture of this. And now you guys have this picture too. So thanks a lot. And if you guys have any questions or anything, comments, anxieties, apprehensions, or emotional outbursts, now is your time. Nothing? Good. Oh, wait. Thank you. Thank you. But it looks like we did have a question, and you're way in the back. Stand up.
You said about building bridges with religious people.
Yes.
I'm not religious, but how would you do that? Like, we're not religious, but people are asking questions and stuff about what they believe, and like trying that in elitism or...
That's so important. I'm really glad that you asked that. Did everybody hear that question? Building bridges with people in the religious community, what does that realistically look like? And I'll tell you, because I'm writing a book that's going to include something of that, but like, you know, and a lot of the material for this actually got from having conversations with people in religious communities. And yeah, like when we have conversations with people, we should include religious people in our conversations. We should be asking questions of people. And I think that what really happens largely when we do have conversations with religious people about veganism is that we kind of condescend to them, because we have this sort of intellectual elitism going on where we already feel like we're in a superior place based on the fact that we don't need these beliefs that these other people obviously take very seriously. And we kind of tend to start off by telling people, which is an incredibly condescending thing to do, what their religious text or what their holy books tell them, or what they should, what their holy books say. And we make these assumptions that they don't already know. Sometimes they don't already know what's in their holy books or what their holy books say about certain things. But I think personally that that's the wrong approach. When we are having conversations with people, ask them what their understanding of their religious material is. What is their understanding of what their holy book says about our relationships with animals? And why they feel like it's important to actually use those texts and those scriptures to form an abusive relationship, or to actually visit violence upon another group. Because 99% of the time, everyone will tell you that their religion is about peace, it's about nonviolence, and this is antithetical to that. And so why does violence fit into your framework of justice? Why does violence fit into your framework of what your God would want you to do to someone who has less power than you? That's the way that I want to approach religious conversations with people. Not from a place of having more intellectual elitism or like a better understanding of their faith than they do, even though I may not share it, but from a place of looking for commonality. And that's the important thing there. Were there any? Yeah, you have another question. Sorry? Well, it's not even entirely finished yet. We're going to have a conversation later, I know, because Casey is the publisher. He's been getting on me for a very long time. But my book is called, I'm sorry, I'm totally drawing a blank now. It's called A Scream of Bloody Murder, an exploration of animal rights through the lens of American blackness. And, you know, and it's really for people who are interested in marrying their anti-speciesism work with their anti-racism work. Because again, we didn't just stop going, like, you know, we just didn't stop being a speciesist on the day that we went vegan. And just because we understand that racism is bad, it doesn't mean that we don't understand how we are still complicit in it. And all of us are complicit in racism, because it's really difficult for even myself as a person of color to not reproduce like systemic whiteness or reproduce like cultural whiteness, because it affects me every day. From everything from my representation to my presentation is influenced by whiteness. And everything about what I do is still influenced by speciesism. Like, you know, how many of us in this room still take vaccinations, even though we know that like all of our vaccines are derived from like testing on animals? It's about like how we form better relationships or how we navigate our speciesism and our internalized racism within ourselves, and how we can become better activists and better advocates for other species and for people who have less racial privilege. Yes?
Hi, a couple of things. I want to take a picture of your ferret bag because I know somebody who spontaneously liberated a ferret recently.
Really?
From a pet shop who the ferret had chewed her own tail off. She was in such a terrible situation.
Oh my gosh.
Going back to the concept of ITAL.
Yes.
I knew that through the work of Maccabee.
Of whom?
Maccabee.
Okay.
Yeah, so kind of British reggae star, and people might know the song "What I Eat." Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
When he describes it, it seems to be about health.
Yes.
Or kind of clean food, that kind of thing. So, can you say a bit more about the thing in relation to? Is there a moral element to it that is not emphasized, or what?
There absolutely is a moral element to it. And like full disclosure, despite what the hair may tell you, I myself am not Rastafarian. And so like I'm speaking from my own limited understanding about Rastafari culture from interactions with other people, including Maccabee. And yeah, like there is a moral element to it. And the thing is, like, there's no one set entry point into veganism, I feel like. Dr. Breeze Harper actually talks about this in her work. I'm very, very much, I'm very much against, criticizing anyone's entry point into veganism. Sometimes people enter into veganism for health reasons. Sometimes people enter into veganism for environmental reasons. I actually happen to have the great fortune of working with a lot of people who are biologists, who are cultural anthropologists, who do a lot of environmental work. And, and they entered into veganism for their own reasons and adopted a moral center or a moral position based on, where they entered into veganism from. And so yes, there is like a health element to it, but there's a huge moral and ethical element to it because like a lot of Rastafari people will tell you, just like a lot of Christian people will tell you, there is Christian veganism and people who use their Christianity for for embracing justice and embracing like more equality or greater peace with their with the other species and the other beings that they share the planet with. And then there are also Christians who, I don't know, picket funerals. So there's a broad range of like how people use their faith. And yes, there are people that are going to use their faith for health reasons or wanting to have a clean relationship with food, but there are other people, and a very large number of people that I've discovered who actually want to improve their relationships with other beings because that's their path to salvation. That's their path to manifesting what their deity, whomever that may be, would want them to do. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else? Everybody want to eat? Because I'll let you guys go if there's nothing else. All right, good. Thank you guys for coming out.